Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. In the lower quarter of Nuremberg, where the old ramparts met the damp air rising from the Pegnitz, there stood a row of crooked workshops. Their windows had long forgotten clear glass. Dust, glue, and the sighs of tired men hung over the street. Among those men worked a boy, no taller than the carpenter's bench, whose hands bore scratches that looked like small brown rivers against pale skin. He came each morning before the church bell rang, careful not to wake his mother, who feared the rent collector more than illness. The boy swept the sawdust before the master arrived, though the old man had stopped noticing long ago. He worked for scraps, a heel of rye bread, sometimes a spoon of broth, and for the right to see how a block of linden wood became a puppet face. In the quiet hours when no one spoke, he listened to the grain of the timber, to the small creaks that seemed to breathe under his chisel. The air carried the scent of resin and candle smoke, and when winter came, thin frost drew feathers on the tools. His world was measured in plain things, the weight of a wooden mallet, the sound of the mill wheel turning by the river, the uneven rhythm of feet on cobbles outside. He fancied he could recognize a man by the shape of his hammer or the wear on his apron. One afternoon, when the sky turned gray too soon, the puppet maker sent him out to fetch kindling. On the way, he passed the big stone merchant's house, where a girl in velvet stood behind the gate. She held a porcelain doll in lace, clean, perfect, motionless. The boy lowered his gaze. He knew the worth of that toy could feed a poor family all winter, yet something about its stillness unsettled him. He wondered how a thing so smooth could feel so empty. That night he scoured through the workshop's refuse pile, finding a piece of half-charred wood and a bent nail. He carved until his fingers ached. His doll looked nothing like the girl's porcelain figure. It had uneven eyes, a mouth that tilted as if remembering laughter. But it seemed warmer somehow, as though some breath lingered inside the crooked smile. He set it on the bench and watched the flicker of candlelight play on its surface, thinking it might be looking back. The next morning, the old master laughed at it, calling it a lump with pretensions. Still, he kept it aside, muttering that perhaps the boy's faults were those of imagination. From then on, he allowed him to help polish the smaller parts, wrists, necks, the joints that gave the puppets motion. The boy learned the hidden logic of balance, the way a thread could make a carved head bow or tilt, how stillness itself could suggest life. On Sundays, he and his mother washed their hands in cold water from the pump, then sat outside the church to watch families pass. The bells rang for Mass, but they rarely entered. She feared pity more than sin.
He observed the city from stone steps, the tailors in green coats, the bakers with flour on their sleeves, the soldiers with polished boots. Sometimes children in ribbons ran by, clutching toys he would never touch. That sight did not fill him with envy, only a strange, tender curiosity. He dreamed quietly of one thing: to have a place where his own work would be trusted, not for glory, but for the steadiness of it, for a room with light enough to see the grain of the wood, and perhaps a window facing the river. In midsummer, the puppet maker fell ill and left the boy to mind the shop. Days lengthened under the hum of flies. Fewer customers came. Fairs drew people to the square. Once, a traveling tinker stopped, admired the figures on the shelves, and tapped one gently. "This one," he said, touching the crooked doll, "has a soul." Then he chuckled and left a coin, though no one had asked him to pay. The boy kept that coin wrapped in linen for years, believing it was a promise. When the old man died in winter, the widow sold every tool except a small knife, rusted but sharp enough for memory. The boy returned home, his pockets light, his mother's face pale with grief. Yet in his chest stirred a quiet certainty that work, his own hands' labor, could build a world even when faith failed. Sometimes, at dusk, he sat near the window. The city seemed half asleep, smoke rising in blue threads above the roofs. He thought of the puppet maker's stories, of saints who carved crosses to ward off evil, of craftsmen who believed wood could remember every touch if treated gently. Fear and faith were neighbors in those tales. The boy never questioned which was stronger. Both lived in the same piece of wood. When spring arrived again, he began carving small toys to sell at the market. At first, no one noticed him. The merchants laughed at his uneven edges. Still, a few mothers bought them for their children, saying the dolls looked kind. He took that as enough. Thus he grew, not quickly, not without hunger, but with patience. Each season left a mark on him: the smell of walnut oil, the burn of frost, the brief joy when the first coin rang in his palm. His world did not widen through travel, it deepened through repetition. And though he still smiled rarely, an odd humor lived behind his silence, a habit of seeing irony in hardship. Years later, when he spoke of that time, he said it was the years of learning how stillness could speak. He learned that work, when done with devotion, resembles prayer, not in words, but in rhythm. And somewhere inside that rhythm, kindness hid quietly, waiting for its shape in wood. The workshop stood, tucked between a weaver's attic and an ironmonger's shed, its door warped from years of rain. A red signboard swung above it, creaking softly as the wind carried the smell of varnish and smoke through the narrow lane. Inside, the craftsman labored with quiet measure. No longer a boy, he had grown into a man of wiry strength, his sleeves rolled, his eyes steady. Dust and shavings clung to his boots, but his bench was always orderly, a small island of discipline amid the clutter of tools. Each morning began with the strike of the bell from St. Egidian's tower. Merchants opened their shutters, and the chatter of apprentices filled the air. Steam from the public baths mixed with the sharper scent of animal glue. He liked this hour best, when the city had not yet found its noise entirely. That was when he carved heads, for only in silence could faces emerge properly.
Customers came sparsely at first, mostly modest folk, bakers, cobblers, an innkeeper's wife with 4 daughters. He listened more than he spoke, and charged less than he should. People trusted him easily, drawn by the calm he carried, though he himself remained cautious around anyone who held a ledger or a seal. Now and then he joked softly, enough to draw laughter, but never too much. Humor, he believed, worked best when it arrived unexpectedly, like warmth from a stove after a long walk in frost. Word spread among traders that the young craftsman's dolls sat straighter, smiled truer. Children held them longer before tiring, perhaps because their eyes were not painted identically. They differed ever so slightly, as though each had been given its own thought. Some mothers said his dolls comforted frightened little ones at night. Others whispered that they watched when no one else did. He only smiled at such talk, too modest to give superstition a home. One midday, a merchant's assistant entered carrying fine parchment orders from the toy market. He praised the quality of the work, the charm of the faces, and promised to find buyers beyond the city gates. Tempted by security, the craftsman agreed. Yet months passed before the first payment, and when money did come, it arrived lighter than agreed. He said nothing. There was rent to pay, oak to purchase, and his mother's medicine to afford. Silence, he told himself, was cheaper than offense. His days followed a rhythm. Morning, shaping. Afternoon, painting. Evening, mending of small joints. Sometimes, when his fingers trembled from fatigue, he would pause to warm them by the candle. He thought of the old puppet maker and wondered whether mastery was ever reached or only chased. Outside, the city was changing. The smell of steam and ale mixed with coal dust. New factories rose beyond the eastern gate, their machines humming late into the night. Men spoke of faster production and mechanical marvels, steel presses that could stamp entire faces in an hour. Such talk unsettled him. What would become of the craftsman's touch when dolls no longer needed hands but hammers? Yet curiosity flickered too. Perhaps there was room for both, a heart-made craft and an iron one. Once a week he walked across the bridge to deliver toys to the marketplace. His path took him past the stalls of spice vendors, tanners, and linen merchants. He liked to linger near a stand selling roasted chestnuts, where he could feel warmth through the paper bag. There, among the crowd, life felt generous and full of movement. This was his reward, not riches, but the sense of belonging among other working souls. People began to know his face. Mothers dipped heads in greeting, children pointed excitedly. In such moments, he felt a fleeting pride, though he hid it beneath his habitual reserve. He noticed the city's shifting fabric, new lighting along the main streets, fashionable hats imported from Vienna, fresh gossip about a traveling inspector for the Toy Guild. These hints of progress brushed against his small world like the wings of unseen birds. At dusk, when shutters closed, he often sat alone by the window. The river reflected the slow bend of lantern lights, and the faint chords of a violin from a nearby tavern reached his ears. He smoked seldom, but lit a pipe sometimes, watching the smoke wander toward the ceiling beams. This was the hour of private reckoning, when he thought about debt, craft, and kindness. He had learned to hide the latter too well. People mistook restraint for coldness. In truth, he gave more care to a damaged doll than he ever had to himself. A week after Christmas, a woman brought her child to the shop.
The girl had broken her doll's arm and carried it wrapped in cloth. The craftsman mended it carefully, asking the child to wait by the fire. She watched him work, astonished by the patience of his fingers. When he returned the doll, she said shyly, "It smiles better now." Her mother laughed, paid double, and left a loaf of bread besides. He stood for a long time afterward, wondering if kindness, once given, could reshape the giver as well. There were days of exhaustion, too. Paint cracked, commissions demanded haste, dull knives cut the skin. He worked on, slow but stubborn. He knew no other form of prayer. The rhythm of carving was an argument against despair. One stroke, then another, until beauty found its shape. In the evenings, he sometimes visited an old neighbor, the same girl who once brought him scraps of cloth when he was still sweeping floors as a child. Her hair now darkened like polished walnut, her laughter quieter. They spoke of small things, prices of food, the city's new mill bridge, the endless gossip from the tavern. Around her, he forgot the merchant's accounts and the shadows of fatigue. Yet he never allowed more than friendship to show. Poverty teaches caution, even in tenderness. By midsummer, his shelves filled with half-finished orders. The merchant's assistant returned, this time in polished boots and finer coat. He spoke of a grand exhibition where dolls of lifelike quality could fetch tenfold their price if offered to wealthy patrons. The craftsman hesitated. He had grown wary of promises, but the notion stirred his pride. To have his work seen beyond the fairgrounds of Nuremberg meant something. He agreed, though unease lingered beneath his calm. On the morning of his 30th year, a number he counted in seasons, not candles, he rose before dawn. Sunlight had not yet crossed the rooftops, but the city already hummed. He stood by his bench, running a thumb over the grains of linden wood. There was comfort in knowing he could read it better than any book, that he understood how each vein guided the knife like memory guiding will. He made a new doll that day, unlike the others, smaller, with an expression almost thoughtful, as if aware of its maker. When he finished painting its lips, he felt the strange weight of recognition, as though he had sculpted not a face, but a question. He wrapped it carefully and set it on the shelf, saying nothing. The city bells rang out the hour. Horses passed outside. Firelight trembled across the tools. Through all the sound and movement, he sensed both promise and warning in the air. The world was changing, and he, at his modest bench, stood quietly between two ages, one carved by hand, the other forged by steel. He wiped the knife clean, trimmed the wick, and closed the shutters. Somewhere below his window, laughter echoed from the street. Life, for the moment, was good enough, fragile, imperfect, yet humming softly like the unseen gears of a clock beginning to turn. Mist covered the roofs of Nuremberg that morning, softening the city's edges until even the towers seemed to drift like memory. In the quarter near the river, where the craftsmen worked, fog slipped through keyholes and under doors, dulling the creak of carts outside. He warmed his hands over the brazier, blinking at the tiny sparks that leapt up and died. Business had grown. Orders for fine dolls came from richer clients now, the sort who signed papers with quills rather than ink-stained fingers. He had learned to smile without warmth, the kind of smile that soothed patrons but asked nothing in return. His trade required tact. A craftsman who served the affluent needed both steady hands and a cautious tongue. Still, he felt pride each time a carriage stopped before his shop, wheels hissing on the damp stones.
It meant he had climbed, by quiet inches, from obscurity. That winter came the visit which would alter everything. A servant in livery entered, bowing stiffly, his gloved hands clutching a sealed letter. The message bore a crest embossed in gold, a commission from a noble household on the hill, requesting a doll of singular likeness, crafted for the daughter of Lady von Heller. An advance in polished silver accompanied the parchment, enough to fill the small drawer beneath his workbench. He hesitated before accepting, half flattered, half wary. The nobility, he knew, admired craftsmanship, but rarely respected the craftsman. Yet something in the description stirred his imagination. A doll in the image of the child, her spirit captured as if in a mirror. The phrase seemed both tempting and perilous. He was escorted days later through wrought iron gates into that upper world of trimmed hedges and marble steps. The air smelled faintly of roses, though the garden slept under frost. Inside, candlelight spilled from mirrors lined with gold leaf. Everywhere shone the calm symmetry of wealth. The lady met him in a music room tiled with blue mosaics, a piano silent in the corner. Her expression was measured, her voice undisturbed by the notion of toil. She introduced her daughter, no older than 7, a solemn, pale creature with large gray eyes that seemed to observe more than she understood. The lady spoke of detail and grace, of folds in satin and hair of spun flax. But the girl whispered a single request before leaving the room. "Make her so she can dream." The craftsman bent his head, unsure whether he had heard right. For many weeks he worked at the commission. The likeness demanded long hours. He studied the sketch the lady had sent, then the small shoes of the child, the ribbon that had held her braid. He shaped the wood slowly, listening to the faint squeal as the blade sliced thin curls away. Sometimes, late at night, when lamplight made the features gleam, he paused. The face that looked back at him seemed uncannily aware, neither cheerful nor mournful, only watchful. He began to dream uneasily. In those dreams he stood before rows of unfinished dolls whose eyes followed him though none had pupils. He would wake with his heart pounding, ashamed of his foolishness. Still at dawn he dismissed it as fatigue. The rational mind rebelled against superstition. Yet old stories clung stubbornly in Nuremberg's alleys. When the doll was finished, it sat upright on the bench, dressed in fine ivory silk. The craftsman stepped back to study his work. There was perfection there, yet it disturbed him. The perfection of still water hiding depth. He clutched the edge of the table until the moment passed. Then he wrapped the figure carefully in linen and carried it himself to the mansion. Lady von Heller received it with satisfaction bordering on reverence. The child, standing beside her, stared long and silently. After a moment, she reached out and touched the doll's cheek, then turned away without a word. The lady thanked the craftsman curtly, hinting at future orders, and dismissed him. He walked home through narrow streets, the fog swallowing the sound of his footsteps. 2 days later, the news spread through the quarter. The noblewoman's daughter had vanished during the festival on the square. Witnesses said she had wandered from her nurse near the puppet booth and disappeared into the crowd. The constables searched the riverbanks, the old quarry, every cellar of the merchant quarter. Nothing. The craftsman
heard the gossip, first from a neighbor's boy, panting with excitement. At the mention of the lady's name, a chill ran through him. He closed his shop that afternoon, though commissions waited half done. By evening, word turned more sinister. Some claimed the child's soul had been trapped in her doll, that the artisan had carved too true, giving his creation hunger for life. The priest warned from the pulpit against works that mocked God's design. For the first time, he noticed how people watched him differently. Market vendors ceased their cheerful greeting. Mothers crossing the square drew their children close. His workshop window became the subject of murmurs. Someone scrawled a crude sign of the cross on his door. He wiped it away, though his hands trembled. Then came the constable, a stout man with a glassy gaze who smelled of wet wool. He asked simple questions at first: where the doll had been crafted, whether the artisan had seen the child after delivery. The craftsman answered truthfully, showing his records, receipts, and sketches. Yet the officer lingered a long time, glancing at the shelves of painted faces that seemed to watch from the dim. Finally he said, almost kindly, "If you hear anything, for heaven's sake, speak up. People are restless." Sleep left him. The following nights he sat awake before the covered workbench. Sometimes, out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw movement beneath the linen cloth, perhaps the shifting of wood shrinking in the cold. He dared not look fully. In his exhaustion, reason thinned, and a whisper of doubt entered. Had he carved too closely, drawn some spark from her gaze into his work? Yet morning came, and logic returned with the light. He told himself what every sane man believes: wood is wood, pigment is pigment. Life cannot lodge where breath never was. Still, something within him wanted to find the truth, not to defend pride, but to silence the trembling of conscience. He went to the square where the child had vanished. Musicians were returning their instruments, merchants shouting the last of their wares. Beneath the laughter he felt unease, as though the crowd itself sought to forget too quickly. Near the puppet booth, a handkerchief lay trampled into the mud, pale with embroidered letters. He picked it up silently, turning it over in his fingers before slipping it into his coat. Night fell before he reached home. The neighbor's lamp flickered through the hallway window, casting strange reflections across the unfinished dolls. He watched their painted eyes gleam faintly, one by one, in the tremor of light. Then darkness reclaimed the room. He sat for hours, head bowed over the bench, neither praying nor thinking clearly. In his pocket, the handkerchief felt heavier than cloth should feel. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, a bell tolled the late hour. The fog thickened once more, swallowing the city whole. When he finally stood, it was as if he had stepped from one life into another. No longer merely a craftsman, but a witness to a riddle that no chisel could mend. Rain had washed the streets of Nuremberg all night. Come morning, the cobblestones shone like dull pewter, slick beneath the feet of those hurrying to market. The craftsman moved among them unnoticed, collar raised, hat brim lowered. Each sound seemed magnified in the damp air: the rattle of carts, the crack of hooves, the low hum of traders calling through the fog. He carried the vanished child's handkerchief folded deep inside his coat, the stitches of her initials already wearing thin. A week had passed since her disappearance, but rumor did not sleep. New tales sprouted where truth refused to grow. Some said the noble family had received a ransom note. Others whispered the mother had locked herself in a dark room and ceased to speak at all. More than one drunk, half in fear, half in delight, claimed to have seen a small ghost wandering the river path, pale and holding a doll. The craftsman walked through these whispers like a man crossing a misted bridge, unable to see where it ended. He had stopped waiting for the constable's return. The first inquiry had ended with polite disbelief. What evidence could a simple dollmaker offer beyond a child's trinket found in the mud? And who among the fine houses would believe his word against theirs? Still, his conscience pressed on him. The handkerchief felt heavier each time he touched it, as if asking to be reckoned with. One afternoon he visited the fairground again. The stalls now stood half empty. Only a few vendors braved the drizzle, their wares smelling faintly of mildew. By the puppet booth, the same one where the nurse had lost her charge, he noticed a man closing the shutters, a lean figure with red hands and an apron streaked with varnish. The craftsman paused. Something in the rhythm of the man's movements, quick, deliberate, rung familiar, as if the gestures belonged to one who had long worked with wood. They exchanged a few words about the weather, the fair's decline, the loud gossip of the city. The man, though friendly, avoided his gaze. It was nothing at first, perhaps only weariness, yet the craftsman felt unease. Behind those hurried gestures lay tension, as though secrecy had stiffened his fingers. That night he thought long of what he had seen. He remembered the merchant's assistant from his earlier dealings, the same man who had promised exhibitions and vanished with payments delayed. Could it be coincidence that one shape of a hand recalled another? Perhaps. Yet unease, once seeded, grows without watering. A few days later, a new whisper reached him through the tavern grapevine. 2 other children were missing, both from merchant families. None dared speak of connection aloud, but fear settled over the quarters like soot. Mothers bolted doors even by day. Woodcarvers burned scraps for protection, muttering prayers against evil. In an older world, these were the signs of plague, though now the sickness came through silence. The craftsman took to wandering the side streets at dusk, moving among shadows and lamplight. The city, usually noisy with trade, had grown cautious. Windows showed faint glows, but curtains stayed drawn. Once, by the bridge, he saw 2 constables dragging the river with hooks, the line trembling in the water, as though the city's own heart were being tested for guilt. He began taking note of strange details. Crates carted at odd hours through alleys. Broken toys discarded near the old glassworks. The muffled laughter of men who hushed when footsteps echoed near. These fragments did not yet form sense, but they pointed toward something deliberate behind the chaos. At home, he worked less and thought more. The dolls on his shelves gathered dust. Their painted eyes dimmed under a film of neglect. When he painted now, his strokes hesitated, afraid of too much resemblance. For the first time, he feared what his own hands could conjure. Late one evening, as the lamps burned low, a knock came at his door. It was old Frau Meisner, the widow who sold candles 2 streets over. She whispered of a child taken from her cousin's household, this time a beggar girl, no ransom demanded. The guard had searched and found nothing, though, she said, one of the constables hinted all 3 disappearances followed fairs or markets where the craftsman's dolls had been sold.
Her gaze trembled between pity and doubt as she spoke. When she left, silence crowded the room. He sat motionless beside the brazier until the coals turned gray.
The thought formed slowly but would not leave. What if his work had indeed become a cipher, a mark unseen yet readable to wicked eyes? The next morning, chasing that thought, he visited the merchant quarter. The assistant who once handled his orders had moved to another street, less reputable and nearer the wharves. No signboard marked the door, only a faded stain where one had hung. A boy, sweeping the steps, said the man dealt now in special goods, a phrase that needed no explanation among the poor. Through a grimy window the craftsman glimpsed crates stacked high and tied with thin rope. On their sides, under smears of soot, were faint traces of his own maker's mark, a tiny carved symbol he placed on every doll's base, half pride, half signature. That sight struck deeper than accusation ever could. Someone had taken his creations and moved them beyond the circle of honest sale. Fear did not come as panic, but as stillness. He stood there long enough for rain to begin falling again, cold and persistent. As he turned back toward the river, fragments of understanding gathered like slow embers. The dolls had been sold not for children's play, but as tokens, perhaps to mark households, perhaps to single out their young for darker trade. The thought left his stomach hollow. By evening he reached the tavern by the bridge, where travelers spoke freely after beer loosed their restraint. He took a seat near the hearth and listened. Men talked of wagons crossing the border at night, of smugglers trading iron, cloth, and sometimes flesh. The name of the merchant's assistant surfaced in muttered curses, tied to deals that ended badly. When lamps were extinguished and the patrons gone, he remained by the dying fire, watching smoke coil toward the beams. He felt neither anger nor relief, only a heavy clarity. The evil roaming Nuremberg wore no magic face. It breathed, bargained, and counted coins. Yet how could he prove it? The constable would demand more than suspicion and a craftsman's conscience. He returned home under a ceiling of low clouds. On his bench lay half a dozen unfinished heads, their wooden scalps blank where faces had yet to form. He turned one carefully in his hand, imagining for a moment that these silent witnesses had seen what he could not. Craft, after all, registered every touch, every hesitation. The thought made him douse the lamp and sit in darkness. Outside a dog barked. Then more faintly, the curfew bell sounded across the river. Through the shutter's narrow crack he saw a lantern pass quickly along the far street, someone carrying a load under tarpaulin, the outline short and fragile. He wanted to call out, but his voice failed him. The figure vanished into the deeper dark. Long after, he rose and placed the folded handkerchief upon the shelf, beside the first doll he had ever carved from burnt wood years ago. In that simple act, he felt both confession and vow. Work alone could no longer redeem silence. Somewhere, hiding behind the city's glowing windows, wickedness used the traces of his hands. It was not curse or spirit that haunted him now, but the slow dawning knowledge that human cruelty needs no ghost to appear monstrous. When dawn came again, thin and gray, he left the house without eating. The rain had stopped, and from the church tower the pigeons lifted all at once, spinning above the rooftops like a flutter of torn paper. The streets glistened under their flight, and the craftsman walked steadily beneath, determined now to follow his own shadows wherever they might lead.
Wind pressed against the shutters until they rattled like uneasy teeth. Nuremberg had grown restless these past weeks, and the craftsman felt that the city itself breathed quicker, its pulse disturbed beneath the cobbles. He no longer slept through any night. Dreams broke apart like badly fitted joints. When dawn arrived, gray and unconvincing, he washed his face in cold water and returned to the workbench, not to carve, but to think. The bench had always offered refuge from storm and rumor, yet now it served as witness. From his narrow window, he saw the lamplighter making his morning rounds, lifting the pole to snuff out the flame left from night watch. The street looked innocent again, and that, he noticed, was its trick. Beneath the calm streets lay the trades of the city's underside, the things spoken of only after the church bell's last toll. He had come to suspect that his former merchant contact, the same one who handled special shipments, had drawn him unknowingly into that undercurrent. By daylight, the workshops around his lane rang with the usual song of labor, hammer, rasp, and handsaw. But at dusk, these noises dulled and transformed. Horse carts traced secret routes toward the southern gate. Men spoke in muttered code, avoiding the watchman's lamps. He had begun following one cart from a distance. Its driver stooped under a broad hat. The road wound toward the disused glassworks by the river, an abandoned structure, its high windows cracked, its chimneys long cold. He brought himself there one evening, under pretense of curiosity. The building smelled of wet ash and riverweed. Wind hissed through the broken panes, creating a faint whistling chord. He stepped inside, heart cautious but deliberate. What light remained came through breaches in the roof, showing a scatter of tools left to rust, and shattered bottles still glinting faintly like embedded eyes. Then something different caught the light. A row of wooden crates placed neatly against the far wall. He bent, pried one open with a splintered board, and froze. Inside lay his own work, half a dozen dolls bound in straw, each recognizable by the delicate carving of their hands and the small symbol near the base. But they were unfinished. Their eyes replaced with small black discs of polished glass. He traced a fingertip along one of the glass eyes and felt chill. Beneath the delicate surface was a pattern of grooves, like lenses cut for instruments. These were no toys for children. More boxes nearby opened to reveal items stranger still, small bottles marked with initials, bundles of clothing, ribbons not yet powdered by dust. Then, faintly, from deeper within the building came a sound, the echo of a door closing. He snuffed his candle and waited, breath tight, until a shadow crossed the narrow corridor. The man carried a lantern, its flame trembling over a narrow face he recognized too late. The merchant's assistant. He moved carefully through the space, humming under his breath, and began checking the crates one by one. When he paused before the open one the craftsman had disturbed, his body tensed like an animal sensing weather. The craftsman did not flee. Instead, he spoke into the dimness, his voice quiet. "You've turned games into graves." The sound startled both of them. The assistant swung the lantern up fast, its light striking the craftsman's face. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the other man stepped back, his expression not furious but weary, as though the discovery had come late and expected. "You work well," he said softly. "Too well to understand the worth of what you make." No more words followed. The assistant dropped the lantern, the glass shattered, and the flame leapt before dying in the damp air. Footsteps raced across the floorboards and vanished outside toward the river path. The craftsman stood still, letting the darkness settle once more. In the quiet, he heard the slow dripping of rain through the roof holes and the faint clicking of a loose shutter. Ordinary sounds, reclaiming a scene that was anything but. He set out to the constable's office before morning, but the desk sergeant, overworked and unimpressed, merely took notes and gave vague assurances. "Too many disappearances," he said, "too few threads to follow. The city wished for calm, not panic." The craftsman left his statement unsigned, realizing words alone could not cut through the thick pain of polite indifference. Back in his shop, daylight fell harshly across his tools. He cleaned each knife in deliberate sequence, as if readiness itself could bring order. Doubt gnawed at him. What he had glimpsed could be explained if one wished. Smuggling, perhaps, not murder. But the missing clothing, the child-sized shoes, told truth enough. Evil preferred trade terms, price lists, and goods discreetly moved. That week, rain refused to cease. The river flooded its lower banks, washing against the old glassworks as though eager to cleanse what lay inside. The craftsman tried again to reach a city official, delivering a note and the marked glass eye he had pocketed as evidence. No reply came. Instead, 2 days later, a stranger waited near his shop. A man in a gray coat, hat brim shadowing his features. He spoke courteously, almost politely, warning that some craftsmen might be safer minding their own matters. The craftsman's hands twitched, but he only nodded and went inside. From then, he worked with shutters drawn, light slipping thin through cracks. Visitors grew rare. Those who came spoke briefly and left, unwilling to linger amid the tension that hung like stilled breath. He felt himself shrinking inward, reduced to craft and silence. Yet under that quiet burned intent. Guilt could crush, or it could sharpen. He decided it must sharpen. Weeks later, before dawn, a muffled roar woke the neighborhood. A fire had begun along the river, flames rising from the direction of the glassworks. Smoke billowed red against the low clouds. People ran with buckets, though too late. The structure already caved upon itself with a long groan. The craftsman stood among them, face lit by the glow. He knew without need of proof that all evidence had been consumed. Fire was the final ledger-keeper. The town murmured that lightning struck, that vagrants camped within caused the blaze. No one spoke of crates or dolls. Yet by midday word came that the merchant's assistant was gone. No body found, no farewell. The disappearance ended gossip, but not unease. That evening, the craftsman sat by his bench with uncharacteristic stillness. For the first time he drank wine in solitude, not celebration, but remembrance. Through the smoky air of the small room he studied his hands. Every line, scar, and callus seemed marked now with responsibility. Creation, he thought, always invites shadow. To copy innocence too well is to tempt those who covet it. He wondered whether skill itself could sin without the maker's consent. Outside, the rain at last thinned to drizzle. The city exhaled, uncertain if its fever had broken or merely changed shape. In the near distance, the cathedral bells began the slow toll for vespers. Their sound rolled over the rooftops, soft yet inexorable, marking an ending none could name aloud. The craftsman rose, set aside wine and tools alike, and opened his shutters again. The wind entered, carrying the scent of char and wet wood, the familiar perfume of labor and loss. He watched the smoke drift above the rooftops until it bled into evening light. Somewhere beyond that horizon, guilt and truth, both unspoken, walked together beneath cloud and ash. He knew sleep would not come, but perhaps clarity would. Tomorrow he would return to carving, not dolls, but plain figures for the churchyard, unpainted, unadorned. The city might forget its vanished children. He would not. And though no one would thank him for facing what others ignored, he found a measure of calm in the thought that even glass, no matter how flawless, remembers every crack it ever carried. Spring arrived late that year. Rain lingered until the first week of May, washing the soot from the stone lions that guarded Nuremberg's gates, but leaving the city hollow-eyed and weary. For months, the fire by the river had been discussed in half-tones, always ending with a shrug. Misfortune? Accident? A punishment decreed by heaven. Yet whispers changed their course once more when, downriver, a charred crate was caught on a mooring post. Inside were human bones, small as if carved for a morbid toy. Word spread faster than the water's flow, curling through alleys and workshops. Suddenly, the name of the craftsman reappeared in every mouth. He had, after all, known the ruined glassworks. He had been seen walking there. He had carved dolls whose faces looked alive and whose likeness might now mean something different. Those who once nodded to him in the marketplace crossed streets instead. He felt the shift as a man feels damp seeping into his walls. First, only an odor, then rot beneath the boards. Rumor gnawed quietly until one afternoon constables entered his workshop without knocking. Their boots brought the smell of rain and authority. They searched methodically, turning drawers, upending baskets, even prying into the jars of pigment. He watched without defense until one of them uncovered among scraps of cloth the glass eye he had taken as proof weeks earlier. The constable's expression chilled, and before he could explain, iron touched his wrists. The word suspicion was spoken plainly now, without understatement. He was led through streets that once sheltered him, past the crooked eaves and tilting chimneys, to the town hall's tall doors. People gathered along his path, not shouting, not openly cruel, just staring, each glance another nail pressed soundlessly into wood. That night he sat in a cell smelling of lime wash and old fear. Across from him the guard hummed an old folk tune, muting it whenever footsteps echoed from the corridor. Candlelight from the corridor reached as far as the craftsman's knees. He stared at it until wax ran low, thinking not of guilt, but of fatigue, the weary kind that made even injustice seem inevitable. The examination began the next morning in a hall of wood and echo. The magistrate, his robe smelling faintly of lavender and starch, asked questions in a tone of politeness that hurt more than shouting would have. There was little to say. He admitted he'd found the crates, denounced the merchant's assistant, described the missing children. His answers were written down by a clerk whose quill screeched softly on paper. Each word looked thinner once trapped in ink.
When they presented the doll from the noblewoman's house, retrieved months earlier from some family chest, something in him faltered. The child's likeness stared out from its glass booth as if still waiting to be addressed. The magistrate paused before it, murmuring a prayer. "Art," he said finally, "is a mirror that may flatter or accuse. Tell us, craftsman, what does this reflect?" He had no answer. The hall smelled of varnish and candle grease. The doll's empty gaze did not shift. Outside, the crowd thickened day by day. Mothers clutching shawls lingered by the steps, eager for justice, but uncertain whose shape justice might take. The constable who had once visited his workshop stood apart from them, hat in hand, waiting as if for a signal. Later that evening, when guards led the craftsman back to his cell, the constable approached quietly and pressed a folded paper into his palm. "Read when no one sees," he whispered. The note, when opened by candlelight, trembled faintly between his fingers. Inside, a single sentence. "The assistant is dead. Confession found near the river forge." No seal, no signature, perhaps even a risk to write. Beneath exhaustion, relief rose like warmth after fever, but it carried no triumph, only sadness, heavy and unshaped. The next day's hearing felt quieter. The magistrate read from another paper this time, sealing the finding with his wax emblem. The evidence of wrongdoing pointed away from the accused. He was to be released, but held under scrutiny until further notice. No apology followed. Freedom was handed like a tool returned after misuse, wordlessly and with faint irritation. When he stepped into daylight again, the sky broke open with light. It dazzled his eyes so much that for a moment he thought the world had lost color. The square lay before him unchanged. Vendors scolding apprentices, birds wheeling above the churchyard. Yet he felt distance in every surface, as if life continued half a measure beyond his reach. He walked toward the bridge, hands bare, hat low. Some recognized him. A few muttered that the judges had been fooled. Others simply looked away, uneasy to face a man who had stood so near the edge of superstition. Days passed in a blur of return. His workshop stood untouched, except for dust thick on the bench. He reopened it after sunset, lighting only one candle. The first touch of the knife against wood felt foreign, unsteady. He carved slowly, relearning confidence the way a healing limb relearns motion, through pain. The constable visited once more, without uniform. He left his hat on the sill and spoke plainly. The merchant's assistant, it turned out, had drowned himself near the same ruins he'd helped set afire. Among his last possessions was a letter of trade accounts implicating others, men of rank who would not see a courtroom. There would be no public reckoning, only silence disguised as order. The craftsman listened, then offered a cup of water from the jug by the hearth. "We do what conscience allows," the constable said before leaving, voice tired but kind. In the uneasy calm that followed, he rebuilt his name, one doll at a time. Children returned hesitantly to his shop, their laughter timid, like birds testing air after storm. He worked gently now, each brushstroke slowed by respect. The faces he carved turned simpler, less precise. The perfection of truth disturbed him. When mothers praised his creations, he only smiled faintly, unwilling to describe the fine line between skill and sorrow. The city itself seemed to breathe easier with summer. The river receded, roads dried, music returned to taverns.
On Sundays, he joined his neighbors on the church steps, sharing bread and idle talk. Yet a part of him remained inward, watching the way morning light fell upon the steeple cross.
The trial had taught him that justice belongs as much to the telling as to the deed, and that rumor, once shaped, rarely dies. Still, in quiet hours, something close to peace began to settle. He repaired a cracked puppet for the school's theater troupe and refused payment. One afternoon, a boy brought him an apple in exchange, green and tart, the kind that tasted of returning seasons. He placed it by the window and left it there until its skin softened, its scent filling the room. When he fell asleep that night, he dreamt not of faces or fire, but of wood grain under sunlight, an uncut block waiting patiently, demanding nothing except the honesty of hands. The faint hum of the city's wheels drifted through the shutters like distant applause, not for triumph but endurance. And though the air still carried smoke from forges and gossip alike, it no longer stung. At dawn, he washed his tools, aligned them precisely, and opened the shutters wide. The day outside was clear, the first in a long while without fog. He watched the ordinary bustle of people moving toward the market and felt an unfamiliar gratitude for the plainness of existence. The world, though damaged, continued to turn, and that, he thought, might be its deepest mercy. The year waned with the faint sweetness of late autumn. Leaves caught in gutters turned soft under rain. Smoke from bakeries drifted low through morning fog. The craftsman worked again, quietly, almost content. His hands had regained steadiness, though not the old certainty. It was a different strength now, seasoned by the long bruising of experience. He no longer worried who might gossip about him. The world, he had learned, forgets eventually, but memory within the heart does not obey. The new workshop stood nearer to the river, modest and clean. Neighbors came sometimes to borrow tools or share a loaf. They called him Master lightly, not as title, but courtesy. Children pressed their faces to the glass to see what wonders he shaped from wood, and he welcomed them, though a shadow always crossed his gaze when their laughter grew too shrill. He tried to live simply. Simplicity asked no defense. One evening, as mist thickened over the river, he began carving a small figure from a piece of linden left long unused. The wood was fine-grained, with a faint scent of honey. He did not sketch the form. It seemed already waiting within, as if time had hidden it there. The knife moved almost without thought. When the head was finished, he recognized what it resembled. The little girl once gone, now long after found only in stories. He laid the carving aside and tried to forget it. But it drew him back the next night, and the next. It wanted completion. Yet he worked slowly, making no eyes, leaving the face blind. He told himself it would be a study only, an act of closure perhaps. But even without pupils, the form seemed watchful, the poise quiet and knowing. When at last it stood balanced on its small base, he brushed its surface smooth and added nothing more. It was a doll of silence, expressionless and dignified. That same week, the constable, aging now, shoulders stooped, came to visit after months of absence. He brought a parcel of smoked fish and a grin softened by years. They shared supper while rain prattled against the shutters. Much had changed, he said. One noble family moved away. The city was raising new tenements near the old walls. A school had opened where the ruined glassworks once stood. For children,
he said, and smiled as if the word itself carried renewal. They spoke of work, the dull rhythm of city life, and then sat in companionable quiet. Before leaving, the constable noticed the unfinished doll and touched its smooth head. "No eyes?" he asked lightly. "None are needed," said the craftsman. The man nodded, understanding more than was said. He left before dawn, promising to return with news of a proposed fair to celebrate Nuremberg's craftsmen. The door shut softly, the echo lingering like reassurance. Days turned gentler. The craftsman began shaping small toys again, simple ones, nothing grand. Horses with tiny wheels, angels with jointed arms, figures for church nativity displays. People seemed to treat him with a cautious sort of respect now, drawn by the humility in his manner, the patience in his craft. He laughed more often, though quietly, as if careful not to disturb the calm that had at last found him. Yet night visits from memory continued, sometimes dreaming, sometimes half awake. He saw again the blue-tiled room of the noble lady, the child standing beside the window, asking him to make a doll that could dream. He would wake then, heart unsteady, and stare at the silent figure on the shelf. Each dawn it stood unchanged, serene in its eyelessness, refusing both accusation and forgiveness. Winter approached with silver light on frost. One morning he carried the doll to the churchyard beyond the river, where a row of small stones bore no names, only dates. He knelt among them, clearing frost from their edges. Here the city buried its least remembered, foundlings, paupers, victims without story. He placed the doll on the low wall beside them, unadorned except for a tiny strip of linen knotted about its waist, plain as truth. He remained there long while, breathing the still air. The sound of hooves echoed faintly from the road beyond the wall, blending with the distant toll of the cathedral bell. He thought of the countless hours his life had spent carving forms from silence, trying to grant them presence. And now, after so much, he understood that every creation holds a trace of its maker's soul, not because of likeness, but because of longing. As he stood to leave, something small occurred. No miracle, only the whisper of balance changed. The doll, dampened by frost, slipped and fell backward onto the ground. Its head cracked slightly where the seam thinned. He stooped, lifting it. The split revealed soft wood beneath, pale as morning bread. Within that fragility was also beauty, the way all things meet time. He smiled faintly, tucked the doll under his coat, and walked back through the quiet streets. At home, he placed the figure by the window where pale sun filtered through late snow. Light touched its blank face, lending it tenderness. He felt neither haunted nor absolved. Those were distant words. What remained was gentler, a slow settling of weight, like dust on finished wood. That night he worked by lamplight on other commissions. Between strokes he would glance at the window, at the small, unblinking witness that seemed to watch over him. The rhythm of carving, sanding, painting merged into calm. It was as though each movement threaded the torn fabric of years back together. Outside, the city slept. By early spring, the festival arrived. Flags hung along the main square, bands played, and merchants' tables overflowed with carved toys and gilded trinkets. The craftsman attended not as exhibitor, but as visitor. He walked slowly among stalls, nodding to former rivals and apprentices alike. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and polish. When he reached the end of the lane, beyond the noise, he stopped to watch children trying wooden puppets on strings. Their laughter rose clear above the crowd. He smiled, not from pride, but from gratitude. Life had circled back to its simplest joys, untouched by guilt or grandeur. Work, he realized, was not only a means to live, but a means to remain human, to oppose the dull cruelty of the world with patient creation. That evening, when he returned home, the room greeted him with the smell of shavings and varnish. The silent doll still waited by the window, unchanged. He lifted it once more, turning it gently. Perhaps he would finish it someday, grant it details, or perhaps it was complete as it stood. Unfinishedness as tribute to all that remains beyond repair. He placed it carefully on the shelf beside his oldest carving, the crooked wooden figure from his childhood. The two stood together, one rough with youth, the other refined through sorrow. In their quiet company, the room felt whole again. As darkness deepened, the craftsman trimmed his lamp and listened to the faint ripple of the river outside. The wind carried the scent of thawing earth, that first promise of renewal returning after long delay. He rested his hands on the bench, feeling the lingering pulse of life between well-used fingers. The past no longer clung. It breathed beside him like an old companion. No one in the quarter noticed when his light burned later than usual that night, or how long the soft rasp of carving continued. But those passing on the street could have sworn they heard two gentle sounds from within, one of knife on wood, and another, tender and nearly human, something like a sigh, fading into calm. Morning came quietly to Nuremberg, washing the rooftops in pale light. After a night of steady rain, the city exhaled a clean, earthy scent. The Pegnitz moved lazily under the bridges, its surface rippling like glass touched by breath. From his small house near the embankment, the craftsman listened to the bustle begin. Hooves clattering, shutters thrown open, the muffled clang from a distant forge. Such sounds no longer pressed upon him as reminders of toil, but floated as part of a rhythm larger than himself. He had long since grown older in ways the mirror refused to show. His shoulders bent a little from years at the bench, and slight tremors sometimes traced his hands before work steadied them again. Still, the lines of his life formed a calm symmetry. The city had changed. Roads widened, workshops replaced cottages, trains now sighed at the far edge of town. Yet time had not exiled him. It had simply folded him into its pattern. The workshop was brighter than his first. Apprentices worked where once only silence lived. Two boys shaped limbs for marionettes, coated them with varnish. A girl painted faces with dainty precision, whispering songs she half invented. Their laughter drifted between the clack of tools. He spoke little while they labored, teaching more by gesture than word. If they erred, he corrected with patience, not scorn. They thought him stern, perhaps, not knowing how much gentleness he hid under caution. By late afternoon, he often stepped outside to watch the light shift along the riverbank. The air carried the smell of bread from the nearby bakery and tar from the boats moored downstream. Children passed on their way home from the new parish school, carrying books tied with twine. Once in a while, one would shout greetings. He answered with a smile and a lift of the hand, glad for the sound of other lives unburdened by memory. The silent doll still kept its place on his shelf. Years had dulled the grain and softened its edges. Visitors sometimes asked what it represented. He only said it was a reminder to work carefully. A few noticed its missing eyes and looked uneasy, but the apprentices grew accustomed to it, as one accepts an old family keepsake whose story has vanished into reticence. On nights of storm, when rain rapped against the shutters and the river swelled, he liked to sit in his chair by the stove. The warmth loosened his thoughts, turning them toward reflection rather than regret. Work of the hands, he understood, had always been less about shaping matter than shaping endurance. To carve patiently was to push against the world's hardness without anger.
Each surface smoothed under his knife was a small defiance of cruelty, a quiet insistence that beauty could survive even in the rough grain of existence. Sometimes he heard, in the distance, the bells of St. Egidian calling parishioners to service. He no longer attended regularly. His faith had settled into something wordless, somewhere between habit and gratitude. He prayed now with actions, repairing toys for pauper children, strengthening benches for the school, restoring broken hinges for widows too frail to lift a hammer. It was these gestures that stitched him back into the community from which suspicion had once exiled him. When his apprentices closed the shop for the day, he remained behind, sweeping shavings into neat piles and oiling the tools until their metal gleamed. The familiar smell of turpentine, clay pigment, and sawdust filled the room, an aroma that seemed to hold the passing years within it. Near the open window, the last sunlight touched the small wooden figures on display. He had never signed them with his name again, only marked them with a simple circle, burned by the same knife used in his youth. To those who bought them, the mark meant, "From Nuremberg." To him, it meant, "From silence." One evening, as twilight merged with drizzle, an unexpected visitor came. A young woman dressed modestly, holding a small child by the hand. She explained that the doll she carried had been her mother's, and her mother, once a frightened girl saved from misfortune, had always said the craftsman's work had somehow changed her fate. She wanted his blessing before passing it to her own daughter. Embarrassed, he placed the doll, one of his early imperfect creations, upon the counter and gently tied a red ribbon round its neck. The child smiled. There was gratitude in that smile that words could not quite carry. After they left, the shop felt warmer, though the rain outside thickened. He understood then that the measure of one's life was not the greatness of its accomplishments, but the small kindnesses that ripple outward unseen. Those ripples, like the faint circles spreading from a drop striking still water, continued long after the drop itself dissolved. Later that night, thunder rolled across the roofs, and the craftsman awoke to the rhythm of rain, steady as the ticking of an unseen clock. He rose, lit a lamp, and sat once more at his bench. In the wavering light, the silent doll gleamed faintly. He lifted it, tracing a finger over the smooth, blind face. Age had not softened its presence. It still seemed to contain all that had passed, sorrow, guilt, work, forgiveness, distilled into calm. He set it down beside a new carving, one of a laughing boy meant for the upcoming fair. The contrast made him smile. Toward dawn, weariness overcame him. He left the shutters ajar and lay down on the daybed along the wall. Rain whispered against the roof. The faint creak of timbers kept him company. As sleep came, the line between dream and waking thinned until both felt the same, a mild drifting of thought over the slow murmur of the world.
In years to come, apprentices would say that on certain rainy mornings, when the workshop still smelled of varnish and the river fog pressed close, one could almost hear two sounds mingling beneath the steady rhythm of labor: the scrape of knife on wood, and a softer murmur beside it, like breath drawn in satisfaction. No one could swear to it, but those who knew the craftsman believed the house itself remembered him, the way wood remembers the patient touch that shaped it. And when the river rose high enough to brush the lower stones of its foundation, it seemed to echo faintly, an unseen hand guiding a chisel, carving, ever so carefully, another day into being.